Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of my Bigfoot sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, love's in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
My Bigfoot sightings happened at Lake Oologah in Oklahoma. Mostly, my family had dealt with Bigfoot all of their lives, being my mom and her family. And then growing up, my granny watching me and stuff like that, we would stay at her house a lot of times while my mom and dad worked, and then the holidays and so forth. There was times we would have such encounters that we didn't even want to stay there after dark. And we loved being at Granny's house, but it could get really bad. But the one I'm going to tell you about right now is after we had gotten older, and my granny, of course, had aged more. She had a stroke, and she was paralyzed on one side of her body, which brought the kids back home to take care of her. She was placed in her bedroom, where she had a touch lamp and a bell that she would ring whenever she would need help. Well, this Bigfoot started getting worse, it seemed, as the kids had come home. And for some reason, they had always thought that Bigfoot was more attracted to my mom than it was any of the other girls. And the only thing that they could ever figure was because when my mom was young, she was left in the car one night while they were carrying groceries in, and she had ran up the sidewalk after she had awoke and saw it sitting at the side of the steps. Had a really close encounter to where she seen it just within feet. After that, and her growing up, it had always bothered her. It seemed like it was more attracted to her whenever we would go fishing or walking or stuff like that. It would follow us. It would kind of like stalk her and just always aggravating her or harassing her. Well, after Granny had got sick, there was 6 girls, and they would all stay a few nights at a time. The other girls would stay, and it would be bad, but it would never be as bad as when Mom would stay. Well, it was aggravating to me because it was bothering my granny, and she was sick, and she couldn't get up. And it would come up to the house at night, and it would scratch on the walls. It would try to open the doors. It would like turn the doorknobs. And we just had a lot of rules at night that we all knew to go by. We would be in before dark, and then we had heavy blankets, we would hang and on the windows and stuff. But being summer night and everything, and Granny only had a water cooler, some nights we couldn't hang up the heavy blankets because it would just get too hot in the house. So on one particular night, we was in there, and my granny was asleep, and I went in to lay in the room to where my mom normally would have laid, and she was going to sleep in the front room. I was staying with her that night because of how bad the Bigfoot coming up had turned out to be. And laying in the bed where my mom normally laid was an old water cooler, and you could lay on the bed and roll over and look at the water cooler, and this is an older farmhouse, so you could kind of see around the water cooler. It kind of like had rusted spots, and you could see the yard light outside. It would shine down through the shade trees, and you still had enough light where you could see the cracks and the bolt holes of the water cooler, and you could kind of see, the light through it. And I was laying there, and I was just looking at it, getting ready to fall asleep. My mom's in the front room, and I noticed the light disappears, like something had stepped in front of the water cooler. Well, I'm still laying there, and through the water cooler, it says my mom's name. Now, it didn't say it like plain, like what a normal person would speak. It was more of a gruffy, I always call it an animalistic kind of a sound. It was a growl kind of, but a talk. And it said my mom's name plainly enough that I could tell that it actually had said my mom's name. And I thought, wow, it really it scared me. It caught me off guard because we had never heard it speak, or I had never heard it speak. My granny had spoke about it speaking. And I jumped up and I ran into the front room and I told my mom. And she got up, and of course, we look out the windows and we're listening. And the back door seemed like that's where it would always go, but the back was always the darkest part of the yard because the yard light didn't cover the back. And it would start like rattling the doorknob. It would push on the door. You could hear the breathing, but the breathing was really deep, kind of like it was having trouble breathing. I don't think it was. I think it was just the size of it, but you could hear the breathing. And it was really weird. But then it stopped that night. And Granny was in her room, and we heard her bell ring. And usually whenever she rung her bell, she needed something. So we go in there and go to check on Granny, and of course, she's asleep. And we thought, that's strange. Maybe she had rung her bell, and she had went back to sleep. So we were standing in the front room again, just right off of her bedroom, and we hear the bell again. Well, we look in there, and she hasn't moved. She's in the same position. So we stand there and we watch her to see if she's waking up and ringing it and so forth. And the bell rings, and Granny didn't move. It had crawled up in the tree by her window, and it was making a bell ringing noise. And we figured what it was doing is it was ringing a bell or something like a bell to try to get the girls to walk past that window so we could see them. And it got really, really bad to the point to where we was calling the sheriff, and the sheriff would come out, and they would look around, and of course they would, not find anything, or they would tell us it was a prowler, or we knew better. Well, I brought my dog down because I had a large Rottweiler, and he was out, and we went outside that night, and the Rottweiler had noticed that whatever it was at the back of the house. So my dog takes off running to the back of the house, and you hear like a large dog fight. And this dog fight is just like, it sounds like, just two dogs just tearing each other apart. And finally, my dog comes running back from the back of the house, and we noticed he had an injury on the back end of him. And the injury kind of looked like a perfect round circle. And we ended up taking him to the vet, and my dog ended up passing away from it. And we were pretty upset over that. So I decided one night that, well, I'm going to catch this thing and find out, what it is. So me and my cousin, we lived about a quarter of a mile from my granny's house. We decided that we was going to stay at our house and let Mom go down there and make it appear that she was going to Granny's alone. And we were going to sneak up in the dark through the pastures and hopefully catch whatever it was and lay out in the field with our guns and get rid of this creature. We snuck up through the field, and while we were going up through the field, of course, we were going slow, and we come up to these old oil tanks, and they had a ladder that went up on them, or they would walk up on top of them to check them. So we decided to go up these steps where we could lay and look at the house, and we had a really good view of the house. And we were just waiting for it to show up in the old yard light down there that was shining through the trees. And while we were laying there, it took a while, but started hearing the dogs barking. And we knew that the action was fixing to happen because every time the dogs barked, we knew it was coming. So we laid there, and then finally, we look at the back of the house and we see the shadow. You can see it moving around the back of the house. So we start moving up through the pasture toward Granny's house. And once we get close to her house, of course, we're moving through the pasture, and there's a lot of blackberries and stuff through there. We get up through there, and it takes off, and it goes back down away from us, down into the hog pasture, into Grandpa's dried up pond that was full of cattails. I'm not carrying the best gun at this time. I'm young, and I'm carrying, a 410 single shot, and my cousin's carrying an old 22 semi-automatic. And we go after it, and we get down there in the hog pasture, and we can hear it in the pond. It's kind of pushing the cattails down, and we pursued it to the cattails, and we went into the cattails, and while we were in there, it comes running out, and it was super close to me. And I did. I shot it. And whenever I shot it, my cousin, he started shooting it, and it fell. And we knew that it fell hard because Grandpa had laid a piece of tin over the part of the pond that would drain out when it would flood. It was like a small little creek that would drain the pond whenever it would overfill. And we would walk across the tin. Well, whenever this thing fell, it smashed down on that tin. It fell really, really hard. And we thought to ourselves, wow, we've actually got this thing. Now, this thing was not huge, like what other people, would call a huge Bigfoot. This, to me, was probably, I'm going to say it was around 6 foot. It was broad. It was very dark down there. There was no light, but you could tell that it was, I would call it husky built. And when we shot it the way it fell, you could tell that it did have, it was large. It had a lot of weight for its size. And because when it fell, just the sound of the tin and the crash, and it was like, wow, we finally got it. So I'm reloading my gun, and of course he's reloading his gun. And whenever we start to reload our guns, it jumps up. And whenever it jumps up, it takes off running up toward the chicken house. This time, it's not running normal. It's running as if it's injured. And it runs up behind the chicken house, which the chicken house was probably, I want to say around 75 yards from the pond. And it ran behind the chicken house, and we got our guns, of course, reloaded, and we started going up through the hog pasture toward the driveway that led to the chicken house instead of going directly to the chicken house. Well, my mom and my granny and everybody in the house of girls, they heard the gunshots out there, and they, of course, came outside to see what was going on, what we had shot at. And we told them what had happened, and they had pulled the cars around, and they had the headlights on the chicken house, and we only had the front of the chicken house lit up. It was at the back of the chicken house, and everybody could hear it growling and scratching, running its fingernails down the back of the chicken house over the tin. It was really scary sounding, and we were wanting to go get it, but of course our moms thought it was too dangerous, and they wouldn't let us go over, and they ended up calling our uncles, and they ended up calling my dad. Well, whenever my dad and everybody arrived, they still had the headlights on the chicken house and everything, and we were standing back because they wouldn't let us go up there. So my dad and uncle, they go walking up toward the chicken house, and as they're walking up toward the chicken house, it takes off running from behind the chicken house, and it had something over its back. Well, the first thing they thought was, Dad and my uncle and everybody, they thought that it had a sack of feed that it had grabbed because Grandpa had hogs and chickens. And they thought, well, it's got a sack of feed. Well, the next morning came around, and we went out there, and while we were checking around, nothing was missing. So my uncle came to the conclusion that what had happened is we had probably shot a juvenile in the hog pasture in the cattails, probably wounded it, he said, and he thought that it had probably died because of what happened the night coming up. But when it was running off, they thought that probably what had happened is it wasn't a sack of feed. It was a larger one carrying off the one that had been shot or injured and possibly had died. And my uncle said, y'all are lucky that you all didn't go to the back of that chicken house because it probably didn't run up there to hide. It was probably trying to lure you up there. So the next night came, and of course, it had never done anything bad when it would come up as far as like tear up anything or kill any livestock or pigs or chickens or anything like that. It just didn't do those things. It just more or less would mess around the house. And we thought probably the reason that it did mess around the house is because Granny was really bad at dumping the scraps out her back door. And the reason she would do that is because my grandpa was a logger and was gone almost all week in Mexico. He would log for a living. And she was home with the kids, and of course she didn't want to go outside in the dark or late evening by herself, so they just had it set up where they would do that. So we always thought that it was probably coming up, to eat the scraps or whatever. But that night, whenever I had shot it, the night coming up, something really bad had happened that night. We were in the house, and it arrived right on time. And this time, it was more beating on the house than it was scratching. It was hitting the doors, kind of like pushing on them. You could hear the creaking of the wood around the door whenever it would push. It was a pretty violent night. And I remember my mom we were sitting there, and I had my old 30-30 that they had bought me. And we thought several times it was going to come in the back door. Well, the next morning, when we all got up, one of Grandpa's large sows had its head removed and placed on the gate to where you would walk in to feed the pigs. And that was the first time that we'd ever had it actually kill any livestock or go to that extreme. And then there was an old Mustang that used to sit out in the driveway. Our parents would sit in the house, and they would all visit, and then us kids, the cousins, we would sit out in the car and, tell our stories, listen to the radio, and talk about whatever. And we was out there one night, and we saw something crawl from the hog pasture up to the side of this old car. And the car, it felt like something was bumping into it, kind of like it was moving. And we felt it pulling on the door handles that night also. And I remember my cousin, she was a little older than I was, she started honking the horn. And luckily, they had turned on the lights. But eventually, we'd have to get rid of that car because after that night, my mom and her sisters, they had a kind of like a plan. We didn't have cell phones back then, so the thing was, if you showed up, something was outside or there was a danger, the warning was they would flicker the porch light, and that meant, don't get out of your car, don't come in. But my mom was getting ready to come down there one night, and she had pulled into the driveway up behind the old Mustang just like normal, and my aunt had happened to look out the picture glass window, and she noticed that this thing crawled out of the hog pasture and was hiding inside of the vehicle right where my mom would have to walk past. And she ended up, of course, flicking the headlights and getting my mom's attention, letting her know not to get out of her car. And they always wondered, if mom would have came past there, would it actually had attacked her? Now, we had a lot of sightings down in this area because we were very active and we fished a lot and things like that. And we went one day, there's a place down on the lake, and they call it the payment grounds. And it's where the Native Americans would trade with the soldiers. And we walked down there a lot, and it's way down in the woods. And you can find a lot of antique stuff down there, arrowheads and things like that. We had walked down there with my dad and some friends and everything, and my mom had walked on ahead of us. And we could see her from the point we was standing on the lake, and we was watching over to where she was walking. And then all of a sudden, my dad had noticed that there was something in the woods that was following my mom. So we started making our way to my mom with my dad and his friend. And whenever we finally got to my mom, whatever it was had left. Well, it was getting to be late evening, and we started hearing like whistling and the whoops and stuff like that. So we're making our way out, and as we're going out, my dad's friend, he sees a large bone. Now, what kind of bone it was, I don't know. He said that he had never seen a bone like that, but he ended up digging it out of the ground and said he was going to take it and have it looked at. Well, we took the bone and we made it back home, and he lived in the little town that I'm from, and it's just a small town. It's 4 blocks by 2 blocks, a little bitty town that sits on cornfields and wheat fields. And he took the bone and he put it on his front porch. Now also at this time he's a deputy sheriff. Well, he ends up calling my dad like at 2 in the morning, and we end up going to his house, and this is on the outskirts of town. And he tells my dad, I don't know what was just here, but something came up here and tried to get me. And Dad's like, what do you mean? He says it was beating on his house, and it tried to tear his air conditioning unit out of his wall where he was sleeping. He was so afraid that he had actually got his gun from under his bed and had shot through his walls. He thought that whatever it was going to come in and get him. You could tell he was just very scared. But the weird thing was, his front porch was screened in, and the bone that he had put on the front porch, it was missing. Whatever it was, he came back, got the bone, and had left with it. And we always wondered, if maybe we had came across a grave or if it was something like that, but we never could figure out what it actually was. We were on our way fishing, and I was probably 15, maybe, something like that. I was riding in the back of our old truck. It was an old blue 1979 Ford pickup truck. And Dad was driving, and Mom's up front. I'm riding in the back with my sister, and we're just riding down the dirt roads, not even looking for Sasquatch or anything. We're just happy to be going fishing. And it's probably one of the better times that I actually saw one. It was daylight, and I was looking off the bridge, and over the bridge there was like a hill that went up to the trees, and then the hill would drop back down to the creek. And I remember I looked over, and I seen it running kind of parallel to the truck, but a little bit away from the truck. And as it was running, it went up over that hill. Well, that hill was in the same direction as, of course, where we would be fishing. And I thought, oh, God, it scared me. And the way it looked was different than most I had seen. I described the fur on it as it looked like the ashes on the end of a cigarette. It was white with the black in it. It was kind of not really a salt and pepper, but more of kind of like how ashes would look on the end of a cigarette. And it ran up over the bluff, and of course, when we got back to the back of the creek, I started telling my dad, I was like, I saw Bigfoot. And he's like, no, you didn't see him. It's daylight, we're going to fish and everything. So they throw their fishing lines out, and we're sitting there, and we start hearing the whistling, and we start hearing the whooping, and next thing you know, it jumps into the water, and we watch it swim across the creek. All of us did. It swam right across the creek, and then back up into the brush. There was an old beaver den back there, and it swam right into that, and then right up through all the thicket. And we had hurried up and, of course, loaded up and left that day also. Probably one of the worst things that probably happened to us as far as like getting really, really bad. We were fishing one night, and we do a lot of nighttime fishing. And when we were sitting down there, for some reason, when we take the boys, which is my little nephew and my son, they will sit in front of us, and they'll play in the sand and the rocks and everything while we're fishing. And then we will fish and keep an eye on them. Of course, we keep them between us and the water. And whatever this was, it would throw pebbles at them and little bitty sticks, and it would make us whooping calls, and it would whistle. But this night, it started making different sounds that we'd never heard. It actually started making baby crying sounds. It started making like little bitty kitty cat sounds. It was just making like anything it could do to get the boys' attention. And Mom was actually sitting to the right of me, and we could hear it on the left of me, and it was whistling, and it was carrying on, and just doing a lot of really vocalizing. And the next thing I know, a rock just missed my head, and it actually hit my mom in the ankle. And it was a big enough rock that it actually hurt her ankle. It skinned the skin on her ankle. And of course that scared me because it had hit Mom and it had hurt Mom. And I'm always carrying my gun. So I pulled my gun and I started looking, and it's still whistling and everything. And we're loading the truck and getting all of our fishing stuff loaded up and everything. And then the next thing you know, one slams into the side of my truck. And it was just, I don't know, I felt like they were actually trying to hurt us that night. And we got loaded up and we started taking pictures. And we could see one, or whatever this thing was, over at the tree, and it was peeking its head around the tree at us. It would like poke its head from the right side of the tree, then it would look out of the left side of the tree, and it would be higher sometimes, it would be lower sometimes. And it was really, really just watching us. It was like it was, I don't know, trying to play like hide and go seek or something, because it would move from tree to tree as we were loading stuff. And it was like we wasn't supposed to be there. We felt like whatever it was, it did not want us to be there, because we had an encounter to where we were fishing one night, and it was kind of like I don't know, it was weird. My brother-in-law was fishing a little ways from us, probably 100 yards, and out on a peak. And while he was fishing, he decided to walk up to us and get some more drinks. We had a big ice chest. So he come walking up. He's getting the drinks out of the ice chest. And of course the fish weren't biting good that night. It was a really slow night. And he had his lantern was lit out on the, this little like peninsula stuck out into the lake. And the next thing you know, you see this thing go walking through the trees up to where he was sitting. And it turns off his lantern. And we're like, what in the world is that about? So we sat there for a while because everybody's kind of like freaked out because this thing just walked out there and turned his lantern off. So me and him end up grabbing our rifles and we go up there to where he was sitting and light the lantern and everything. And the weird thing was all his fish bait was gone. He had some fish he said he had cut up that he was using for fish bait. It was not just perch that we had caught, nothing special, but he had cut the perch up, and the whole board that he had the perch all cut up on, and the perch, it had took all that. So we were sitting there, and we can hear it walking behind us. And as we're fishing, we finally look, and you can see it walking up the side of the creek. And I kind of walked toward it because I got my kids down there, and I'm kind of wondering, is this a man maybe, Is this somebody, Is he going to try to hurt us? And while I'm walking at it, it's not turning away from me. It's coming right at me. And at one point, I started feeling a little uncomfortable, kind of threatened. And I yelled at it like, you would somebody. And I said, hey, you can't be walking up here. I got kids up here. What are you doing? Who are you? And it keeps walking at me. And I drew my firearm. And because it had been throwing rocks at us on the previous nights and throwing pebbles and stuff, I told it, I said, if you come any closer, then I'm going to shoot you. It's going to get bad. It actually laughed. And my mom, it freaked me out probably more than my mom because I had never heard one laugh. But it started laughing. And I remember telling my mom when we left, I said, had you ever heard one laugh like that? And she said, yeah, we'd heard it a few times. It was like kind of like a dog, like a big dog that you could picture how they would kind of laugh or what they would sound like. And then, this is the time me and my cousin got in so much trouble, but man, we were so glad to be home. Back behind my grannies, my cousins would always walk to a bridge that was, it would have been a half a mile. It was a mile section, and halfway through the section, there was a bridge, and they called it Swinging Bridge. Well, they would walk down there, and they were older than us at the time. We weren't never allowed to go because we couldn't hang out with the older cousins. So we would always have to stay home. They would go down there all the time and spend the day. The older ones, they swimming, whatever, playing on the bridge. Well, they came back one night and they were telling Granny and everything that they were followed by something and they didn't know what it was. Well, we kind of thought they were pulling our leg or whatever. So one day, my mom, of course, she worked and I stayed with my granny. So me and my cousin had stayed the night and we decided, hey, we're going to sneak down to this bridge and we're going to see what this is all about. Now, we had never been there, but we had an idea of how to find it because we'd heard them talk about it so many times. So we take off walking, and it's full of persimmon trees. You happen to walk through all these persimmon trees, and they're really, really thick persimmon trees. And we're kind of like making our way through all these persimmon trees, and to the right, it's not really a house. It's like a small building, or kind of like a house. It had a window in it, maybe like a workshop kind of. And we got to looking at it, and of course we started daring each other. We were like, "I dare you to go look inside there and see what's in there," And I was like, "I'll go look." So I go up and I open the door on this building, and when I open the door, it's more of a kind of a rectangle building. It had an old wooden roof with the wooden shingles, and it had one window in it, and the door was a door that had been built. It had just the long, like 1x6s. So I opened the door, and whenever I opened the door, it's like full of random stuff. There's like a hammer, there's baby dolls, just odds and ends, just weird stuff. And some of it was kind of like antique stuff, but over in the corner was it looked like a nest. There was a lot of hay. It was all piled up, and there was like a hole in the middle of it. And I remember it stunk really bad in there. It kind of smelled like where Grandpa would keep his pigs inside of the pig houses. It had a really strong smell. And I was looking around, and over on the bench, there was a old time, like, I think it's called like where they would wash their hands with it or whatever, but it was like the bowl that had the pitcher that sat in it. And I was like, wow, that's old, because I'd seen one in Grandma's house. She had one that actually had the stand that held it. And I remember telling my cousin, I said, that's old. And when I walked over, I looked in it, and that's whenever it really got scary, because when I looked in it, I found a toy gun that I had lost at my granny's that my mom and dad had bought me. It was a cat gun, and it was kind of expensive for the time. It was metal and, the magazine removed and everything. And we had lost it and felt really bad, but there it was laying right there in that picture. And was like, oh my God, that's my gun. So we start walking out of the door, and whenever we do, there's a man, and we think it's a man, and it's walking through the woods at us. And our first thought was it was a man in a ghillie suit, like what you would go hunt, in a ghillie suit. And my cousin looked at me, and my younger cousin is standing there, and we're like, oh my God. And we look to our left, and there's another one coming from the other way, and we thought, oh God, they've caught us in their stuff. So we took off running. Well, they started following us. And we were running up and down these hills back in the back country, and we actually got lost. And this thing, they kept following us. And my youngest cousin had asthma. And whenever we had got to the top of this last hill, he looked at us and he said, I can't run no more. He said, my asthma is bad. He's trying to breathe. We could hear him wheezing. And it was just like, this is it, we're going to have to fight because we can't leave him. So we start looking for clubs and branches or whatever we can find, and we're hiding on the top of this hill. And down below it's a large valley, and then up above it is another hill, and they're just like rolling hills all through this area. And the reason they're like that is because the coal mines had dug it. So we're hiding, and we can see them over on the top of the other hill walking. And you can see them looking. They're like looking for us. And it was really scary. We sit there and we're just hoping, that they don't see us, that they don't come and get us. And the good thing was the wind the way the wind was blowing, it was blowing in our face. And we knew that's probably all that saved us because they didn't smell us. And we ended up going deeper down, and we were lost, and we were afraid we were going to be out there in the dark, and we didn't want to be in the dark with them around because we knew how bad it was at Granny's. It was just a bad situation. But we ended up finding some old highline wires. And we knew they had to run to town. So we start following them. And they take us up to the highway. We were so glad to see the highway. A lady we knew from town happened to be coming down the highway. And she gave us a ride, of course, back to my granny's. We was so glad that we ran into her because we was just imagining staying all night down there, lost in the woods, not knowing, what these were, where they were at. It would have been a real bad night. And then there was a time they would come down sometimes, and it seemed like they would always go to the hog pasture. It seemed like that's where they really liked to go. And whenever they would get to the hog pasture, they would hang out in the hog buildings and stuff like that. They would beat on the buildings at night. You could hear them beating on the buildings. It was just it's like they would work their way up to the house. And the windows, they were real keen on the windows. And we always knew when you was in that house that you walked as quiet as you could because they would follow you outside from room to room. They knew which room you were in, and you could just hear them outside of the windows. And it was so scary because you never knew, man, if that door was to open, you never knew what you was going to be looking at. And a lot of people talk about the hitchhiker effect, and that's actually what had started everything at my granny's. When they had bought the house, they didn't have any trouble until my uncle had came back from Vietnam. And he would take his girlfriend out to this field, and they would sit with other couples, and they would try to scare their girlfriends because stuff would happen. On one night, something did happen. Something jumped on their car. And whenever it jumped on their car, of course, they left, and they came back to Granny's that night. And that's when it all started. The breathing, the scratching. And after that, it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And it always had fish scales. There was fish scales on his car, too. And just stink. It stunk so bad. And then, I was talking about it speaking. There was a night my granny was sitting in her chair. And of course, it was an old house. And she was sitting in her chair, and she would look out the front door. And out her front door, you would go onto the front porch, was covered in with plexiglass, and it also had a door on it. And she would leave that door open, and then down that door was 2 large concrete steps, and then her sidewalk that was under the shade tree that was blocked, would block a little bit of the yard light. And she would sit there, and she smoked. She would smoke and look out the door, and the cool air would come in. And then one night, it did step up on her sidewalk, and it stuck its hand out, and it motioned to her like you would somebody, to come here. And my grandma's name was Helen. And she said it kept saying, Helen, over and over, making the motion for her to come here. Well, that same thing, whenever my little cousin, she was outside playing one day, she was about 10 years old. She come running in the house crying and having a fit. And they couldn't get her calmed down for a little bit, but when she did calm down, they asked her what had happened. And she said while she was outside playing, a hand had stuck through the grass and was telling her to come here, and it was calling her by name. So whatever these are, I've never heard them speak like in a sentence. Mostly it was just a single word that they would use. I never heard a sentence. It was always just a single word. But they loved to, you would be sitting in the house, and we found out that they would get on the roof because we would get something knock at the door or knock on the window, and you could be watching out the window, and you would never see anything at the door. It would knock, and you would look, and there's nothing there. And then one night when my uncle came down, because it got real bad, and they were beating on the windows, and they were beating on the door, and we couldn't figure out where they were at. And then finally, my uncle got to looking at the plexiglass door on the outside, and he noticed that there was mud up on the top. And he said, "There's how they're doing it. There's a upside down knuckle print." And of course, we didn't catch on. Me and my cousin were like, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's on the house, leaning over, knocking on the doors." He said, "Y'all don't be going outside because it's staying on the house, and it's reaching over, knocking on the windows." And of course, it was knocking on the doors. And then I'll share this story with you. This one's kind of a sentimental kind of a story. Some people say that Bigfoot has a snout. Some say that he doesn't. But there was this guy that lived in town, and he was the big football player. He got into a lot of fights, just the rough, tough kid, that you always grew up with, that wasn't afraid of nobody. He was really strong. He could fight. He told my granny, he said, "I'll come down there and I'll get rid of whatever this is." He had never experienced anything cryptid, so his thoughts were it was just an old pervert coming down there because the girls that were there. So he came down one night, and he was sitting in the front room with my granny and everybody, and they were visiting. And of course, he's waiting for this thing to show up because he's going to go get rid of it. So while he's sitting there, of course, it shows up, and it starts beating on the back door. And Granny said, without even, any hesitation, he jumps up, runs out the front door, around the side of the house to go confront what he thinks is probably going to be somebody. Well, he comes back into the house, and they said he fell on the couch, and he was just as white as a sheet. And Granny said he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't tell nobody what he had seen. And he left. He wouldn't tell nobody. I mean, nobody. And whenever I started investigating this stuff, of course, I wondered what he had seen. Because even when I was growing up, him, an older man, he was always known to be this tough guy that nobody messed with. He was just really strong, fighting guy. He was just that type. And he was friends with the family. He'd always been friends with the family. And I reached out to his daughter and asked if I could speak to him. And I asked him if he would tell me what he had seen that night, because I was curious, and I told him, I was looking into this stuff. And he still wouldn't tell me. A few months passed, and I had been doing my channel, and he got sick. He ended up getting COVID whenever COVID had come around, and she told me that her dad had got really sick and that he was in the hospital. He unfortunately ended up passing, but he had left me a letter, and the letter he left me, it explained what he had seen that night. I read the letter, and pretty much what he said had happened was he jumped up, and whenever he ran outside and ran around to the back of the house, he said he came around the corner of the house, and he was 6 foot, I think he was 6'2". And he said, whenever I came around the side of the house, he said, there it was standing. And he said, it was so big. He said, I remember when I went around the corner of the house, he said, I had to look up at it. He said, it was standing there. He said, it wasn't as furry as what people say. He said, it did have hair, and it was covered in hair, but it wasn't the thick, bushy hair. He said it was standing sideways of him. And he said, whenever I looked at it, he said, you could see its hands. It had large, he said, like skin-colored hands. You could almost see the skin color in the darkness. You could tell that they were the skin. He said the feet were the same way, and around the face had blotches of skin. Through the hair you could see the skin color. But its head was sideways, and he said it had somewhat of a snout, and it was grabbing Granny's scraps that she had dumped, and he said it was like eating the scraps, but it wasn't eating the scraps through the front of its mouth. It was shoving them in the side of its mouth, he said. And he said, I'm telling you, the food was running all over this thing. He said it was just grotesque. He said it sees me, it's standing sideways of me. It raises its head up. It is standing bipedal, and it's reaching down, scooping the food up out of it's an old hog trough that Grandpa had made, a big steel hog trough. And it's scooping the food up out of this hog trough, and it's shoving it in the side of its mouth, getting it all over it. And he said it tilted its head, and it smiled at him. And he said when it smiled at me, it said, hello. He said, I knew at that time that if it wanted to kill me, Mike, it was going to kill me. He said, I had no chance against whatever this was. He said, the only thing I could think of was to turn and run and get inside the house. So he turned and he ran as hard as he could. And he said, I ran into that house and I fell on that couch. And he said, my chest hurt so bad I could not breathe. He said it had to be a panic attack. He was freaked out so bad. And it bothered him so bad that he used to hang out with my uncles. He stopped hunting with them. He stopped fishing with them. He would not come down to their house no more. He stopped doing everything that he'd done in the outdoors after that night had happened. And I was blessed that he wrote me the letter, because we would have never known. And unfortunately, he had passed away. But he called it 50 years of terror. He said, I held that in for 50 years because I didn't want to believe, he said, what I seen that night. He said the way it looked when I came around that corner, it was just bent over and with his long hands just scooping the food, up out of that old trough and just slopping it in its mouth. And he said the way, it smelled and the way it looked. And he said the hands were kind of like what reminded him, but they were really large, but like the color of a possum's hands. He said they really kind of glowed that skin color in the feet. And he said it just how it turned its head at him and all. He never could return back to the woods after that. He said it really changed his life. And he actually, they ended up, whenever he got a little older, they moved from our small town and moved into the middle of a city because he said he just did not have no desire to go back to the city. And, there was a lot of guys that came down there that tried to get rid of that for Granny. One in particular, he was a friend of the family. And my granny's house, the back end of it had burnt. And it had no roof on it. And he said, well, I'll come down there. I'll get rid of it, And they were laying in the back bedroom. He was 18, and he was with my uncles and all. And while they're in the back bedroom, whatever this thing was, it jumps up, grabs the side of the wall of the house, and looks over the wall at them. He never came back to my granny's either. So a lot of people tried to get rid of this for us. They tried to remedy it for us. They tried to debunk it. And he said, when I went around inside the house, he said, I don't know. He called it a beast. He said it was just a beast. He said this thing was powerful. It was not afraid. He said it was not afraid of me at all. He said the way it looked at me and everything, he said it knew, he said, that if it wanted to kill me, he said it would have killed me right there. He said it was just a huge predator. And I remember Granny even talking about one time when she was in the bathroom, they had a little small sliding window that was above the bathtub, and she was taking a bath one night, and it actually had stuck its hand in through that window and was feeling around on the wall while she was in the bathtub. And she said the same thing that he had said, though, that she had told me in my cousin's stories before, that its hand was like that bright white kind of humanish flesh color. It's not like ours where I'm like, I am Indian and my skin's kind of brown, but she said it's like that bright white color, like the real white hand. And she said the fingers are just long. Now the nails, a lot of people say they see claws. And I asked my granny if she saw claws, and she said no, she did not see claws, that it actually had regular fingernails. They were long, but not extraordinarily long. And she said it just was a huge hand, and when it reached in, it was filling all around, and actually ended up knocking the shampoo off of the shelf that she had there. But the things that it would do down there, I want to try to tell this story and try to tell it as where I can to keep it as family friendly as I can. You know, a lot of people say that Bigfoot or Sasquatch doesn't get along with dogs. We kind of had that happen, but kind of not. It seemed at Granny's if the dogs didn't bother it and they didn't go after it, that it actually wouldn't hurt the dogs, because they had a little dog that they kept inside of their house, and this little dog's name was Tippy. Now, what was weird, if it was going to be like, say, a night and it was going to be like thunderstorms, or the weather was going to be really, really bad, you know, or a lot of rain or whatever, you just knew it was going to be bad that night, because the more rain and the more thunder, and the worse the rain and the thunder, it would always be worse. Well, this little dog that my mom and, of course, the 6 girls, they shared it. It was in the house, and it was raining one night. And of course, they live in the middle of the country. And once you go outside, you just get drenched in the downpours. And it was raining, and the trees, she said, were soaked under the house. You know, the trees are just soaking, and just a hard rain. And the little dog goes to the front door, and it wants to go outside. So they let the little dog out, and it wasn't much longer. The little dog comes back up to the porch, starts scratching on the porch. So they let the dog in, and they said the dog is bone dry. And Granny said, that is really weird, you know. So the little puppy goes back over to the door, starts whining and crying, and they let it back out. This time it's gone for a long time, and it's raining and raining and raining and raining, and finally it scratches at the door again, and they open the door, and whenever they open the door, the dog is completely dry, except for it had what appeared to be on it semen. And Granny took the dog, of course, washed the dog. She didn't say nothing. And that was what always made her believe that the animal part of this creature, Bigfoot, had this connection with animals, because that little dog, it knew whenever it was around. Granny said she could be sitting on the couch and that little dog would be there, and all of a sudden the little dog would run over like to the wall, or, you know, by the air conditioner, because, you know, air conditioners, they allow airflow in and out of the house even when they're not running. And the dog would run to the air conditioner over by the wall, and it would start sniffing. And Granny said about 10 minutes after that little dog would do that, well, that's whenever it would start messing around, and that little dog would just have a fit to go outside, and that's where it wanted to stay. As long as it was around, that's where it wanted to stay. So there was a connection, at least, between that little dog and whatever that was. There was a story my granny knew. This family, they lived a little ways from us, and they had a son. He was, I think, probably 12 or 13, and he was born with autism. And he would play outside most of the day, and he would come in. He got to where he would stay out later and later and later, and the mom, of course, you know, would tell him, you need to come in, it's getting dark. They live on the river bottoms also. And the little boy would stay out longer and longer and longer. And one day he told them that he had a friend. And they said, well, who's your friend? And he said, oh, just a friend that comes up and plays with me. Well, they thought he had an imaginary friend. This went on for a while. And as it went on and on and on, he would stay out later and later and later. And eventually, he never came back one night. And they always figured that whatever it was had either took him or done something worse to him. But that lady, I remember talking to Granny, she'd always wondered, you know, what had happened to her son. Now, this would have been back in like the 50s. And they searched and searched and searched everywhere. We had a weird incident down on the lake. Me and my cousin, I had worked in security and law enforcement all my life, and I grew up on this lake, so I know this lake pretty well. It's still big enough and brushy that if you don't watch what you're doing, even knowing this place, you can get turned around and really lost. There was two guys, and they were boating down here, and they did not know the lake. Well, they capsized their boat late at night down in this dark lake that I live on. And of course, the family called in and said that their family had not returned from their fishing trip. So, of course, that got us all where we started, a search and rescue. And they asked me and my cousin if we would go help because we knew the lake really well. We hunted and fished it all of our lives. We said, yeah, we would go. We built fires all the way down the lake in case they were out there, that they would be able to see the fires, to be able to come up to the fires. We had the fire department and everybody there. And we ended up finding the two adults really fast. The two children that they had with them, they was 8 and 10. Couldn't find them for a long time. And of course, you think that they're probably in the lake or along the lake, and we never found them. Well, later that night, almost into the morning hours, one of the dogs had picked up trail. And these two kids, somehow, and they still don't know how it happened, but these two kids were up probably 50 yards from the lake, up through the brush and through the trees. Now, this is really thick brush and really thick trees. They were placed underneath a log, a big tree that had fell, and there was leaves and limbs and a bunch of debris had covered them. And they were covered enough that if the dogs wouldn't have hit on them, they would have never have found those two kids. It was just by just a blessing that the dogs hit on them. And, they were deceased when we found them. But to this day, they don't know how they got placed under that log and how all those leaves and everything had got placed over them with the limbs and everything, because they were totally covered underneath this log. And they still don't know how that would have happened, because they were so far away from the lake that there was no way that they could have been placed under there, plus the leaves and limbs and debris that was placed over them, and they were pushed up underneath this log, like the log was dug out under it, and they were up underneath it. It was really hard for a lot of people. We wasn't sure, what had happened or how they had got put there, and I know that even a lot of the firemen that were down there that had lived in the area, there was a lot of speculation. You never know what those kids had ran upon, and I know that working with law enforcement, working in security, that there's protocols. If you go to a house or you get a call of a cryptid or a Sasquatch, or somebody sees, even, if they say it's a dog man or whatever, the protocol is that they have to put it down as a prowler. So, it makes me wonder how many times have things happened that really wasn't what it was written as, or how many times was there something that was misidentified, because there's a lot of cases out there that you look at and you dig really deep, and I've dug really deep on a lot of them, and there are so many things that are left out, and it makes you wonder if it's on purpose or what's really happening. Being a kid and seeing these things and growing up around them and being in that house, going to the bathroom, I would have to go to the bathroom. I remember just being terrified to have to go to the bathroom, because when you would walk through the house, if you creaked the floor, it knew where you was at, and the bathroom was right by the back door. And man, I've walked past that door before, and it would hit that door and rattle the doorknob, and you thought it was going to come in, and you would run, and you would always run. But when you would run to the front room, you could hear it outside running, and then you could hear the dog outside barking, following it. And it was just like, there was times you just didn't even want to be there. We would even tell our parents sometimes. They'd be like, we're going to go down and visit Granny tonight. And we were like, can we please leave before dark? Because I was outside playing with my cousin one night. And I was probably 12, 13. So he was probably 10. And we was out in the front yard and just messing around, like kid was just messing around, and I remember seeing something over by the honeysuckles. And I asked him, I said, "Do you see that over there?" And it was on the other side of the fence, and the fence was covered in honeysuckles over by the hog lot. And he's like, "There's somebody over there." And we got to looking, and you could see something moving through the honeysuckles. Well, he walked over a little closer than I did, and whenever he walked over there, it started shaking the fence like really hard. So we took off running, of course, and whenever we ran in the house, you could hear it outside doing that creepy laugh. It was actually laughing at us. And I remember Granny was telling everybody, shut the windows, lock the doors, because you could hear it, and it was just like doing that evil, deep, kind of like a growl laugh, kind of like like somebody that kind of needed to clear their throat with a laugh. It was really gurgly, just scary sounding. And it would actually laugh at you at times whenever you would get scared. So, I mean, there was a lot of bad things that happened down at that house. You know, we always wondered if my mom was imprinted, or do they imprint on people? Because even to this day, right now, whenever we go fishing, or if I take my mom to the woods, and if we're down there into the evening or into the dusk, something will happen. This year we're going to go fishing again, and I'm sure something will happen. And it always does with Mom. I don't know why. I've wondered that since I was young. You know, what causes these things to be attracted to my mom? Why does it happen? You know, you worry about your mom. But there's something, I think, personally, that whenever she got out of that car that night, and she ran up those steps, and it was laying there, and they looked at each other eye to eye with just feet apart, I think, honestly, that was something happened there that caused it to never give up looking for her, or bothering her, or following her, or harassing her, or I don't know, but I don't know. I think personally there's something with that night and what happened right there that made it worse when my mom was down there. And I think that we have to be careful, because I think some people, it just, I don't know if it gets fascinated with you or something, but there's something there. And those are just some of my Bigfoot experiences. And if you'd like to listen to my YouTube channel, I do a lot of investigations and boots on the ground. It's Abnormal Investigations. Got a lot of video footage and some vocals. So you can check me out over there. And also, I'd like to thank Vic for having me on his show. I'm very, very honored to be able to tell my encounters on the show here. And y'all support him. He's done an awesome job.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves and the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah, the sound of a memory brings me back to the bluegrass playing on my dad's 8-track. His pickup man had been through it, getting through the day on Scruggs and Skags, bucking hay bales to those Tennessee jams. There's no other way that I'd do it. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Somebody call it backwards and double time, looking at the soul and the strumming on Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Pace of the city life drives me wild. The only tune is the cars rushing by, with the bass on the stereos booming. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out. I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards, backwards in double time. Getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out. I don't run from banjo music. Something going backwards, backwards in double time. Getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm, fried chicken, porch swing, mama's best sweet tea kind of sound. I don't